Well, good morning. Actually, by the time I finished saying that, it was afternoon. It's just after midday here now. I'm going to talk today about the essential role of dopamine in depressive illness, in severe depressive illness, and therefore why MAOI antidepressants are very likely to be particularly effective in more severe cases, because dopamine is almost certainly a key neurotransmitter in moderate to severe depression. But before I start talking about that, I would like to say a few words just to bring people up to speed with the general situation. We're working very hard on the website to improve knowledge and availability of these MAOI drugs. That's what all of your donations go towards, and we need them. Heidi's computer's failed. I need to buy her a new one. That's a significant expense. And there are a lot of sub-programs and apps that we need to do all the different things to run everything. One of the main purposes of the website now, and one of our main concentrated sources of activity and effort, is this problem of the diminishing availability of MAOIs and what we really have to do about that. As I've said in another talk I gave recently, there's only so much I can do, and it's important for everybody listening to understand and remember that it's consumer demand which is the only major factor which is going to change things. If enough people make enough clamour about it, something will probably happen. I'm doing what I can, and some great news is that we've been able to engage with the European Brain Council to get their support in seeing if we can get the WHO to put these drugs on the essential drugs list. As a very quick aside, the WHO Essentials Drug List in psychiatry needs a considerable shot in the arm, in my opinion. It looks as though it's rather out of date and hasn't had the serious and important input that it deserves. Don't forget, some people are listening to this as a podcast, others are seeing me in my study in North Queensland, possibly even seeing a glass of wine in my hand here. And it's important to remember that almost everything that I say is very substantially consolidated by the various commentaries on the website, and a lot of new material has been going up on the website in this last few months. So keep looking, pay attention, and I think you'll find there is a lot of valuable information there. Okay, now, having updated a great deal of material relating to parnate, tranylcypromine, and Nardil, phenelzine, and also Marplan, isocarboxazid, which isn't so widely available, but is the third main old irreversible MAOI drug, which is important and worthwhile keeping available in the therapeutic armamentarium. That is something that really is very important. So that reminds us of what's been happening and these different antidepressant drugs and how there's a lot of new information on the website. The next thing I want to do is to outline the background research and rationale that reinforces our confidence that these MAOI drugs are unique and absolutely necessary for a significant proportion of people who experience more severe depressive illnesses. The role of dopamine in depression has historically been very much neglected. I think there are all sorts of reasons for that, which we won't go into at the moment. But it does illustrate the fact that so much of biomedical research is determined by influences in society, not by pure research considerations. But I'm pleased to say that when I came to revise a paper I wrote about dopamine depression quite a long time ago, I was really quite pleased by the amount of new material that there is reinforcing from a pure research and a clinical research viewpoint how great the evidence now is that dopamine plays a very central role in depressive illness. The other aspect that I was very pleased to notice when I looked at all of this was that one of the points that I've been emphasizing for a very, very long time is the different underlying dimensions of these illnesses. The most obvious one is psychomotor retardation in severe depressive illness, which is really very, very like the slowness of movement and slowness of thinking, bradykinesia and bradyphrenia. Bradycardia, slow heart rate, brady just means slow. Slow thinking and slow movement. That is an essential core feature of Parkinson's disease, which we have known for many, many years is related to underactivity in the dopaminergic pathways. So this is a really important development, which I'm very pleased to see. So people are now in research talking much more about how lack of motivation is a psychopathological dimension which you can look at in relation to Parkinson's disease, serious depression, Alzheimer's, and schizophrenia as well, the amotivational state that's characteristic of a lot of cases of schizophrenia. That has stimulated a lot of research which may not be directed at elucidating depression, but which, needless to say, has as a side benefit a lot of useful information about depression and the different drugs that manipulate the dopamine system. Now, as far as drugs that manipulate the dopamine system are concerned, there are really only 3. Amphetamines, been around for 100 years. Well, almost. Yeah, very nearly. Late 20s, early 30s. 1920s, 30s, I mean. So amphetamines, methylphenidate, it's been around quite a long time. Although they're lumped together as stimulants, that's more bad terminology. Their mechanisms of action are quite different. Essentially, methylphenidate is a dopamine reuptake inhibitor, so it's the same mechanism as serotonin reuptake inhibitors and the tricyclic antidepressants, which are essentially noradrenaline reuptake inhibitors, but acting on the dopaminergic dopamine system. And then, of course, the monoamine oxidase inhibitors. There are various reasons for supposing that blocking monoamine oxidase to raise dopamine and noradrenaline and the other stuff, serotonin, is important in severe depression, i.e. all 3 of them. And MAOIs are the only drugs available that do that. But there's also good reason to believe that raising those by blockade of monoamine oxidase, as opposed to other mechanisms, and there are several other mechanisms which can have at least some dopamine boosting effect, but doing it by monoamine oxidase inhibition may well be the best way of doing it. Certainly, as far as the drugs we have available to treat humans are concerned, MAOIs are really the only drugs that do it substantially, and all three neurotransmitters. So that means they're central and crucial in the treatment of severe depression. So let's just say a bit more about what is the role of dopamine in the syndrome as a whole. Energy and motivation, anergia. Dopamine clearly plays a crucial role in that, and all the recent reviews that have been done, both from animal research and from human research, substantiate that very, very clearly. Cognition. Dopamine plays a key role in cognition. And if you think of the analogy that I've used before, the mental anemia analogy, having low dopamine is like having a battery that hasn't got enough charge and can't hold enough charge. So you can't light things up properly with it. And of course, if you can't light things up properly in your brain, you can't think properly. So you're thinking slow and inefficient and indecisive. And experimental work shows very convincingly that dopamine plays a key role there in cognitive ability. And lastly, the key business of anhedonia, the ability to experience pleasure. Dopamine, again, undoubtedly plays not just a key role, but the key role. There doesn't seem to be any other neurotransmitter that has a substantial effect on either of those three mechanisms. Well, that's not quite true, but certainly not on anergia and anhedonia. Cognition, perhaps a few other neurotransmitters chime in to contribute. So you really can't get much more important and much more central in terms of what's going on in depression than that, can you? I think if that was more widely appreciated, perhaps more people would be more interested and more motivated to use MAOIs more often. And this applies especially in the aging population, because, of course, prodromal stages of Parkinson's quite often present with depressive-type symptoms. You can discuss whether it's typical classical depression or whether it's something slightly different. But as I think what I've already said illustrates, that's actually a bit of a spurious argument. The point is that those essential underlying changes to do with motivation, cognition, and anhedonia are a key part of all of those states, whether it's described as Parkinson's with depressive type symptoms or whether it's classical depression with psychomotor retardation. It's two sides of the same coin, if you like. That's how I would describe it. So boosting dopamine in those patients is doubly, triply important. So the aging patients with poor cognition and depression and probably a bit of slow movement as well, and psychomotor retardation are absolute prime candidates for a drug like tranylcypromine that boosts all three neurotransmitters. In animal work, for instance, if you look at the different drugs that affect the dopamine system, there's very, very clear evidence that drugs that deplete dopamine have a profound effect on the kinds of dimensions of the illness that I was talking about before. And furthermore, I guess in a way you could say what's even more important is that drugs that increase dopamine reverse those changes. And that includes dopamine reuptake inhibitors, even the very weak dopamine reuptake inhibitor bupropion, Wellbutrin, strange name for a drug, isn't it? It's a terribly weak dopamine reuptake inhibitor, but it undoubtedly has small but significant effects in reversing those low dopamine related changes in experimental animals. And I really don't think there's any doubt at all, although this may not be very well reflected in double-blind trials, which many of you will know I think are a very overrated investigational technique, a very blunt instrument to dissect the subtleties of these conditions. But it's very clear from clinical work that people who respond to tranylcypromine very frequently will tell you that if they've had bupropion previously, that it did something which was a faint echo of what tranylcypromine does. People will describe quite clearly how they noticed small but significant increases in their motivation and stuff. So I think that amounts to a very, very convincing case that even a very weak dopamine reuptake inhibitor has some significant action in improving those sorts of amotivational and anhedonic symptoms. And incidentally, remember, and I've written about this elsewhere, of the SSRI drugs, which I don't think are really appropriately described as antidepressants, to be honest. I think they're anxiolytic drugs, really. But of that group of drugs, one of them, sertraline, which is my preferred SSRI, always was, has quite significant dopamine reuptake potency. Its actual affinity, its Ki at the dopamine transporter, is about 20 from memory, whereas, for instance, methylphenidate, which is probably the most potent dopamine reuptake inhibitor available for clinical use in humans at the moment. Pity there aren't others. But its affinity is more like 50. That may or may not be a significant difference because you can overinterpret these in vitro values for these things, but nevertheless it does suggest quite strongly that sertraline may actually be more potent as a dopamine reuptake inhibitor than methylphenidate. Now, I think one of the interesting potential sequelae, consequences from that, is that there is modest evidence that of that group of drugs, sertraline is less likely to cause some of the Parkinsonian type side effects like akathisia that SSRIs sometimes precipitate in people, and also less likely to cause cognitive difficulties. And pure serotonin reuptake inhibitors do reduce frontal dopamine activity because serotonin has an inhibiting effect on frontal dopamine. So there are two potential advantages of even a relatively weak dopamine reuptake inhibitor. And like I said, that might explain why serotonin could be a bit better from some of those points of view than the other SSRIs. And it certainly explains why bupropion has a small but significant effect. So, obviously, further evidence for this whole business about dopamine comes from the dopamine depleting drugs, whether they are the old-fashioned rezapine type Rauwolfia alkaloid derived from Indian folk medicine from the days of the Raj, as it were, and developed in the 1940s, I think it was, around the time the original antituberculous MAOI drugs were discovered. A lot of the patients originally treated with iproniazid for tuberculosis in the early 50s were also on rezapine. And so if you dig back into the old literature, you'll see that some of the patients treated with isoniazid for depression were also on rezapine. I think that was misguided, but let's not go into that at the moment. Anyway, those drugs deplete dopamine, and obviously the neuroleptic anti-schizophrenic drugs like my bête noire, quetiapine, Seroquel, the Miraquel of Seroquel I've written about, are potentially very harmful because, of course, classically those drugs precipitate a Parkinsonian syndrome that's indistinguishable from Parkinson's disease, for the very obvious reason that they're designed to inhibit dopamine, which they do very effectively. So there you have a fundamental paradox or contradiction, in my view, in terms of what clinical science suggests. It doesn't demonstrate clearly, but suggests might be helpful for people with depression, which is augmenting it with antipsychotic type drugs. And their actual effect in terms of what we know about what dopamine does in the brain and why increasing it is a good idea in depression, not decreasing it. You don't remove blood from people who are anemic. And it doesn't make any more sense to inhibit dopamine in people who've almost certainly got underactive systems in the dopamine department. It seems to me to be one of the most glaring paradoxes in modern therapeutics. But that's just me. Anyway, as far as quetiapine itself is concerned, I should emphasize, just to stop people worrying about it too much, that that's another misclassified drug. It's really a fairly specific antihistamine. It's way, way more potent as an antihistamine than it is as a dopamine reuptake, a dopamine antagonist. It's extremely weak, and it's doubtful, and that is backed up by positron emission tomography studies. It's very doubtful that quetiapine has significant antidopaminergic activity until you get into the hundreds of milligrams. Whereas it's a potent antihistamine at a dose of 25 to 50, as is, of course, the ultracyclic doxepin, which is essentially a specific antihistamine. And in fact, the neuropharmacological profile of quetiapine is very, very similar, more similar than it is to anything else, to the very earliest anti-dopamine type drugs, promethazine and promazine, which takes us right back to the beginning of the history of antipsychotic drugs. And they were abandoned because they weren't strong enough. Yes, anyway. So both dopamine depleting drugs and drugs that block postsynaptic dopamine receptors, dopamine antagonists, both exaggerate all of those symptoms we're talking about that are core symptoms of depression. I think that's sufficient theoretical information to usefully substantiate the whole idea that increasing dopamine is a good idea in severe depression, and that decreasing it is a bad idea. And if you're a Bayesian, I won't try and explain what Bayesian logic is now, but there's a good Wikipedia article on it for anybody who's interested. If you're a Bayesian, you would really want extraordinarily strong evidence that a dopamine antagonist helped people with depression in order to use powerful drugs like that with serious long-term side effects, etc., etc., etc. You'd want extraordinarily strong evidence before you started using them for people with serious depression. And in my submission, that simply does not exist. The double-blind trials that claim to show that drugs like quetiapine help a little bit in augmenting antidepressant response are pretty unconvincing, and the degree of response is quite small. So I think that's insufficient evidence to engage on what seems to me to be a fundamentally illogical course of action. All right. Don't forget all the information on the website. Don't forget to do whatever you can. If you're not able to make a donation to help the extremely important cause of making sure these drugs remain available. You can still do a lot by spreading word on social media and so on and so on and so on. And Heidi is working very hard to make sure that we've got a section of the website giving up-to-date information about this awful situation with the diminishing availability and production difficulties and heaven knows what else. It's very, very difficult to get to the bottom of it, but we're doing what we can. All right. Thank you for listening, and I hope that's been edifying.